Welcome back to DPReview TV viewers. It is Chris Nichols here, and we are out on a balmy winter day. It's really quite pleasant. The cold weather's disappearing, much like our show for DPReview TV, but the show does have to go on, and so today we are looking at a preview of the brand new Sony ZV-E1. This is Sony's first attempt at a full-frame vlog-style camera. So where is the camera? Well, Jordan is filming me on it right now, so you're gonna have lots of footage to watch, lots of samples. We haven't had a ton of time with this camera, so we're just gonna preview the main features, the new stuff which we find really interesting. And I think it's also important to start off with just saying that Sony is not marketing this camera as a hybrid photo video camera. They're really pushing it towards the video aspect. So let's talk about the limited photographic capabilities first. So you can notice the camera's tracking me really nicely right now because this has the same autofocusing algorithms that we have in the advanced Sony A7R5, and that's very positive. I mean, this camera for photography focuses just fine, but it is the Sony A7S III sensor, 12 megapixels. For serious photographers, that might not be enough, but for vloggers and Instagram social media use, it's perfect. No, wait, I know I just said 12 megapixels and you're really screaming right now like, well, Chris, it's actually a 48 megapixel quad Bayer sensor which outputs an effective 12 megapixels through pixel binning. Or we could just say 12 megapixels. Now, as far as capabilities go, the first thing I found jarring, no mechanical shutter, just electronic shutter only. Now, thankfully, the sensor reads out fairly quickly, but you'll still see rolling shutter rear its ugly head in some of your photos. The other thing, of course, no EVF. I'm just shooting off the LCD back panel, and although that is doable, it is far from ideal when you want a strict photographic experience. Now, Sony do say this camera is their lightest and most compact full-frame camera with an IBIS system in it, and it does indeed have IBIS, which is nice. Not their most advanced unit, 5-stop stabilization, but still absolutely welcome to have here. And it is light, 483 grams. I mean, that's less than a quarter of a knock. It feels very much like a Sony a6000. In fact, it handles very much like a Sony a6000. Dual control structure, but it's the dual dials where you've got one on the top, one on the back, but they both have to be operated with your thumb. It's not the most ideal setup, but frankly, Sony's marketing this more towards people using the touchscreen anyways. We are going to talk about how they've changed that because that is quite interesting. Overall, though, we have a camera which handles well, has a slightly larger grip than an a6000. That lets you fit a Z-type battery, and that is a big benefit to battery life. Now, the Sony ZV cameras have always had features to make it a little bit easier for people just starting out in photography to get a handle on more advanced controls. So, for example, background defocus has been a feature we've seen on other ZV cameras. Rather than understand how aperture works, you can simply use the background defocus to either have your subject in focus, everything else a soft blur, or everything in focus, for example. But now they've improved that to go to a My Image style function where you get 4 features that you can customize without knowing all the photographic terms. So you've got background defocus, you've also got brightness, which would take over instead of exposure compensation, you've got color, which will cover things like white balance, and then you've got creative style where you can get creative and just kind of change the overall look, you know, change different filters and things like that. I do feel, though, a lot of people buying this camera are going to probably either graduate from that quickly or already be well past that point. We do like that on this camera you've got full control of your exposure settings right off the touchscreen. Really handy because it's silent. It's also nice when you're vlogging, you can simply touch the screen. Another interesting feature that they've just added is a new cinematic vlog mode, and actually Jordan's using that right now. You may have noticed the actual frame has changed on me. We're now in a 2:3:5:1, very old school cinematic kind of scope look, and it's also locking your frame rate at 24 frames per second, which is very interesting. You know, that doesn't bother us because we shoot our show at 24, but if you'd like to shoot 30 or 60, just keep in mind, this is 24, and I think it's all meant to make things look very classic cinema. But we have some additional features here that are interesting. So the first category I would say is the overall contrast of your image. You've got classic Cinetone, which we really like. I mean, that's our favorite profile that Sony makes for general work, but you also now have a clean, a chic, and a fresh look, and you can see how that changes the overall just, you know, feeling of the video. Beyond that, then you've got another setting, which is for more of your color. You've got auto, which looks like it just balances the color appropriately, but then you've got ocean, you've got forest, you've got gold. I mean, these are things which actually imply an overall color balance shift in your video to really change the mood and feel. You also have an autofocus transition speed adjustment, which is nice because if I want to pull from one subject up close to something in the background, I can change to a very slow, dramatic push or a very quick, snappy push. And that can actually have a very strong impact on the feeling of your overall video. These are all ways of getting that cinematic look. So this camera has these interesting features which should be really fun for, somebody who wants to take a more simplistic approach to videos, start to get interesting color, interesting looks. And I think that's great. But for a more advanced user, you might start to find that what this camera actually does a lot is crop. This camera likes to crop. We're going to talk, it's cropping everywhere. So even this is a good example. Going to the cinematic vlog mode, we're already at 16:9, barely at 4K with this sensor, but all we're doing here to get that scope look is just letterboxing the top and bottom. We're just filling it with black, chopping it off. And so that's the first part of our crop, but it gets worse. Okay, vlog time. I'm in full auto here. I'm using the built-in microphones because why not, even though we've got a perfectly good lav on. I'm using the 28-60 kit lens at 28mm, but most importantly, I want to also show you how the stabilizer is working. So right now I'm using the standard stabilizer at arm's length. You can see a little bit of bouncing there, but now I'm going to cut. It's a little bit jarring, but I want to show you the next stage, which is active stabilization. Now this is going to be a little bit more stable, but you may notice that our crop is just a little bit tighter. Active stabilizer crops in slightly to give you a little bit of an extra edge as far as stability goes. Unfortunately, it means that we're not getting true 4K. The camera's going to interpolate that back up, but it's a pretty minor hit. And I think it's also important to point out that in this mode, the camera does store the gyroscope movement data here. So if you use software like Catalyst afterwards, you can get even better stabilization post if you want to do it that way. Okay, you're good. I don't need you to hit the record button. Anyway, okay. Okay, so he's running off clearly. So now we're in the dynamic active stabilizer. You can see the crop is very heavy. Is my hair even still in the shot? I doubt it. Honestly, at 28mm lens like this, I think this is basically unusable. Yes, it's stable, but again, remember, we're cropping heavily into the file. It's up-resing it back to 4K. We're gonna hurt that image quality. At least if we had a higher megapixel sensor to start with, we'd still get the same annoying too tight crop factor, but we wouldn't necessarily have to interpolate to 4K and lose that image quality.
All right, it's Jordan Drake here behind the camera recording this lovely video of a park bench to talk about the microphones. It's the same 3-capsule system that we've seen previously in other ZV cameras, but now you can manually select. Do you want it to prioritize in front of the camera, behind the camera, or everything around it? But now we've got the new automatic mode.
And the automatic mode is great because if I sit here in front of the camera, it detects me, the more important presenter, and then very intelligently prioritizes that we should really be listening to me talk. Yeah, that's how it works, Jordan. So now it's probably honing in on my voice because it's a smart camera.
True, I guess.
So now I want to talk about a really interesting feature called the auto framing feature. Now this is really handy if you don't have anybody to help you out and you want the camera to track you as a frame. So right now Jordan's going to tap on me and it will actually go down to the tightest crop right on my face, and as I move around it should follow me. Really handy, and Jordan's not zooming or anything like that. I can go further away, I can walk towards the camera, and it just keeps me in the frame. And this is really interesting. So you've got a small frame like we're using right now, more of a medium-sized frame, or then a really large frame. And also Jordan can cancel the tracking and it's actually then automatically return to our standard original frame. Now this is really cool because it lets you set up some very interesting shots on a tripod, and you can also do things like have the crop show up on the video that's recorded to the SD card, but if you have an external recorder that could stay uncropped, so you could always have multicam shots or decide how much of a crop you want after the fact. It is a really interesting feature. Regardless though, let's remember that this is cropping quite heavily into the frame, and as we've talked about already, it's already 4K at the largest view. If we do any cropping, we're immediately losing resolution, up-resing in a huge way, and our video is going to look terrible. Anyways, it's cropping again, but it is a really handy little feature.
All right, it's Jordan here in front of the camera now to talk about the sensor on the ZV-E1. And Chris has already banged into your head, yes, it is a low-resolution sensor, and this can be a real problem if you're using any of those new modes that require a heavy crop. But let's remember, one of the big advantages of this sensor in the A7S III, the FX3, FX6, it reads out very, very quickly. And one of my biggest problems with the ZV-1F, the ZV-E10, is they had terrible rolling shutter that looks awful when you're vlogging. When you're carrying the camera and walking around, the jello effect was just atrocious on those, where here, it is actually quite well controlled. The other benefit to this sensor is it's getting you full width readout at 4K up to 60 frames per second. Now, I don't want to be a conspiracy nut or anything like that, but I do have my suspicions about one thing here. This camera is going to be able to advertise no crop 4K on the box, but eventually through firmware, it is going to get 4K 120, this is using the same sensor as the A7S III, so that means there will be a crop when we use that. Same deal with the 1080 240 recording that is also going to come later in a firmware update. Just be aware, there are going to be a bit of a crop on it. Now, I'm a professional. I'm not going to do an overheating test on a pre-production camera, but I'm a little concerned that Sony's materials say that we're going to get 30 minutes of recording in 4K 60 and doesn't specify for any of the lower frame rate 4K modes. I mean, if you need to record very long clips or in a hot environment, then it's probably going to be worth spending the extra money on an FX3. But this is definitely something we're going to test when we get a production model just on a different channel.
Okay, so let's conclude our little preview here. And you know what? I have to admit, I think I've been way too harsh on the Sony ZV-E1 here because yes, it does crop a lot into these 4K modes, and I stand by the fact that the quality is going to go down, but we also have to look at it with a different perspective and put it into context for how we're going to actually use this content. You know, being able to set up the camera on a tripod and have it frame you and follow you automatically. You know, doing things like active dynamic stabilization when you're vlogging with an appropriately wide enough lens. Now, not to go back and over the cropping again, but really the fact of the matter is Sony is bundling this camera as a kit with the 28 to 60 kit lens, which came with the Sony A7C. Perfectly fine lens, but I just feel that 28 mils just not wide enough, especially if you want to vlog. So I do wish Sony actually made a bundle with the 20 to 70 f4. I think that lens would be fantastic on this body, and maybe they will in the future. If not, maybe it is worth just getting the body and getting that lens separately. You know, having the capability to do cinematic vlogging and give your video, you know, instant grades and just different feels and moods, I think that's all positive stuff. And when used for the social media applications that these are largely going to be used for, I feel like the 4K resolution isn't really necessary. This is where we're going to probably be shooting a lot in 1080, or even if we shoot in 4K, we're not really going to see the problems with up-resing the 4K in social media. And so I think largely you're going to get away with it. And then if you do want to focus more on commercial applications, or maybe you're not going to use things like the dynamic stabilizer very often and the auto framing, well, then you're getting a relatively affordable camera that still gives you 4K 60 with minimal rolling shutter, a fairly fast reading sensor, and that's a really good thing. And I think, you know, for where this target audience, this camera's aimed at, they've done a really good job. Because if you're the kind of person that says, okay, I know I'm going to need longer record times before it overheats, or I know that I'm going to want to be able to record raw video out of the HDMI port, you know, stuff like that, well, then you already probably know that you're looking at something like maybe a Sony FX3 instead, or an FX6 even. So really, I think where this camera's aimed, it's very smart, and I think it's actually do very well. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this little preview. Remember, we are going to look at this camera again very likely when we go to our new channel at Petapixel. So if you haven't already, subscribe to that channel, follow us there, and the show will continue going forward. Otherwise, if you have any comments below, definitely do leave those. Thank you so much. We'll see you guys soon for one more episode of DP. Oh no, wait, there's more than one episode. There's still a bunch coming, don't worry. The show's still going to, there's more. Just stay tuned. Okay, we'll see you soon.